You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 189. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers. Our big theme for the month is being a learning leader. Now, before we go any farther, part of why we're talking about this is, once again, to remind you that throughout 2021, we're talking about different characteristics of courageous leaders. And so learning leaders are courageous leaders. But another reason, less important, but we want to name it for you, is Tim and I are both experiencing some transition in our leadership roles. My role in the district and annual conference changed on July 1. Tim has just taken on another district as the district superintendent. So welcome, Cap North. So you might say there's growth happening in terms of the territory that we're responsible for and in how we do our work. While some may focus on, wow, you've got another district, and how my responsibilities have expanded beyond Cap South, those changes for us mean one of two things. We're either going to get stuck in a fixed mindset, that's the way we do things, that's the way they've always been, or we'll embrace a growth mindset and see the possibilities in learning in the midst of that. So I don't know about you, Tim, but if I'm going to be a learning leader, it means for me choosing a growth mindset. Now, of course, there are moments that I get stuck in a fixed mindset. I'm human.
I think, Sarah, just to get started, is that it's important to us, that's the reason we talk about it, of being courageous and effective leaders. And being a learning leader is certainly at the heart of courageous leadership.
Yeah, so let's pause for a moment before we go any farther, and let me remind you that you can find show notes for this episode on the podcast page at transformingmission.org/podcast.
Let me start with this. Why don't we define a couple of the terms? We've thrown some things out. We can't just assume that we know what they are. So what do you mean when we talk about fixed mindset?
Both of these that we're going to talk about come from the research of Stanford University psychologist Carol Dweck. And she studied and researched achievement and success. And what she found was that people who have a fixed mindset believe that their basic abilities, their intelligence, their talents are just fixed trait. They have a certain amount. That's that. Can't grow. It's what you have is what you've got. There's no change that's going to happen. So that's a fixed mindset.
So before we talk more about a fixed mindset, let's also get an understanding of what a growth mindset is.
So in a growth mindset, people understand that their talents and their abilities can be developed through effort, good teaching, and persistence. They don't necessarily think everybody's the same or that anyone can be a genius by studying a lot, but they do believe that everyone can get smarter, and you can't see me doing air quotes right now, if they work at it, if there is effort put into it.
So we have a fixed mindset and we have a growth mindset. What does it mean as we talk about this fixed or growth mindset? What's it mean for Christ-centered leaders, for courageous leaders? What difference does it make?
Yeah, so one of the places that I think, and we'll have a conversation about this, that leaders, including Christ-centered leaders who have a fixed mindset, those leaders have a deep-seated insecurity. They have to keep showing up and showing others that they are a genius. They have to try to prove that they're smart in something. So people with a fixed mindset are afraid to find out that they aren't very smart in something. And that may sound harsh to some of you, and it may sound like, well, that's not me. But this can show up in really simple ways, like not pausing to ask a question when you don't know how to do something, not turning to the person who has been the expert in your field to say, teach me what you know, because of that insecurity of not being the best or the smartest person in the room. Another place that this might show up is if you are a leader of other people, and in the life of local congregations, there are lots of people, I hope, that you are leading, teams of people. It can show up in micromanaging people. When you have to know all of the details, you have to have your hand in everything, and you can't release people for the work of ministry and trust that a team of people are going to take something and run with it if you have defined the project or the task that they are to work on. And so there's an element in there, I would say, of trust that comes into play as well.
Yeah, Sarah, I would agree about this micromanaging piece. It's because we don't know all that we think we ought to know, that we have to help people understand that we do know. So we have to keep control of it. So, and for some of us, it is that we have to know how everything's going to turn out before we ever get started. And for me, in the work of the church, particularly, I think it's just the work that goes on in the whole world, is that if we actually are going to live into what God is giving us along the way, we may not know how it's going to turn out. It's a matter of being open to how that leading may take us at any moment. And I think micromanagers cut that off pretty quickly.
Yeah, you said it better. Control was the word. It's not, I think trust is an aspect of that, but you named it in terms of control. And I think when we try to control things, there's an insecurity there. Because if we don't know, then we're not the one that's the smartest one.
Well, I think what we're talking about, at least from my perspective, is that we think that good leadership or effective leadership is knowing everything that's going on and having some control over it. And sometimes the best leadership is to be able to face what we may not know what's going on and be able to adapt to it. And so a fixed mindset, I don't think is very adaptable. There's not a whole lot of adaptability.
Fixed?
Well, yes, that is.
Tim's trying to be filled with grace here, folks. I'm going to name it. If you're in a fixed mindset, you have a preconceived idea about how something should be. And if the people that you are leading aren't mind readers, and guess what? They're not, and don't deliver something in the way that you had envisioned it because you didn't communicate the expectations, you're going to micromanage. And that all comes from that insecurity of a fixed mindset. There's one way to do this. I need to be in control and in charge, and I'm not going to show my vulnerability. Again, remember that courageous leaders, one of the skill sets that we practice is learning how to rumble with vulnerability. So, I alluded to this, but all of us are going to have moments that we move into a fixed mindset. And so when you recognize that moment, what you can do is say to yourself, okay, what just triggered me having a fixed mindset? Start at that place so you know what is happening to trigger that for you. And then you can move into a growth mindset. And that's really where we want to focus. But before we do, we want to say one thing about what a growth mindset is not, because in the life of leadership, I think when we think about growth, we think about accumulating knowledge. We think about a pastor who has a library filled with books, and you can't see me right now, but right behind me, there's a whole bunch of books on a bookshelf. or a whole bunch of books on a computer or on a Kindle, whatever format you like to read books in. Or it might even be on Audible. You might be listening to the books. But when it comes to learning and growth, we all know that learning happens in more ways than just in books. It happens from experiences in life and in leadership. It happens in the day-to-day conversations. It happens in formal ways and in-person classes and online classes. It might even happen on podcasts, YouTube.
Oh, I think especially on podcasts.
But a growth mindset has nothing to do with knowledge. And that's what many of those things point to. It points to the accumulation of knowledge. So when you think about a growth mindset, Tim, you had something that you wanted to offer in terms of life experiences and a growth mindset.
Well, Sarah, I would be as fixed in my mind as saying that somebody that's in a growth mindset is actually seeing Jesus in everyday situations. As we keep talking about where have you seen God today or where have you seen Jesus today, a growth mindset has you looking for Jesus in everyday situations.
Yeah, and it's not always going to be the same way because you're willing to be surprised.
Exactly.
There's an openness there to, okay, Jesus, where are you going to show up today? But I also appreciate what you just said about the intentionality of looking and focusing on, hey, Jesus, where are you at today and what is happening? So another way to think about a growth mindset for Christ-centered leaders is to think about it more in terms of transformation than simply about the accumulation of knowledge. A growth mindset is about the transformation that happens. So when we think about a growth mindset for Christ-centered leaders, staying focused on transformation in your life and leadership, and Tim just named one thing that we can all do every single day, is pause to reflect on, where's Jesus showing up? Sometimes I'll say it this way, where's Jesus showing up and showing off in your life today? What are other things that we might need to think about as Christ-centered leaders and focusing on transformation?
Sarah, I need to say this. It's stuck in my mind. I know we want to talk about...
Is that fixed?
I stepped into that one, didn't I?
Sorry.
No, as we talk about accumulation of knowledge and information, there is a difference between getting a 4-point and getting the point.
Yes.
There are a lot of people that have 4-point but miss the point. And when we talk about having a growth mindset, we're talking about at least not only getting the point, but living it. And so when you talk about other experiences, what's the point to worship? Is it the music? Is it the style? Or is it the transformation? And who's being transformed in the image of God? Those two things, to me, go together. They may not go together for other people, but we know a whole lot about worship. We've got books on worship. But what's the point to worship?
Yeah, so what you just pointed out in both of your examples, both the 4-point and missing the point, and the contrasting, is it about the music that is being sung? Is it about the content of a sermon? You might not have said that. I might have filled that in. Or is it about the transformation? It's the difference between focusing on the process or the journey and focusing on the quantitative outcome. If you are focused on how many butts are in seats on Sunday morning for your worship service, I would say that that's a fixed mindset. You're focused on a number. If instead you're focused on the transformation, you're going to recognize you don't have any control over that. God can use all types of music. God can use all types of preachers. God can use all types of people who show up or don't show up or show up online to invite them to be transformed into God's image. And so the difference, the analogy that's coming to my mind is when you have a conversation, let me say it this way. As a child, when you came home with your report card, where did mom and dad focus? Did they focus on the grades that were not so great? Did they focus on the grades that were great? Or did they focus on what did you learn this semester? Those weren't the conversations that we had. What did you learn this semester? It was great job on your grades. And so there was a reward for getting the A's and the B pluses and being on the honor roll. That's a very fixed mindset. You have defined one place that you want people to be. So sometimes doing things that are hard is how we experience a growth mindset. And someone who ends up with a C or even a failing grade may have much more of a growth mindset than the person who received the A, because the focus needs to be on the process, not on that final letter grade. I think how Carol Dweck says it is, don't praise the intelligence, praise the process. And so when we think about that in the life of the church and as Christian leaders, what you're pointing to, Tim, is focus on the process of what does it mean to experience worship? What does it mean to worship God and the transformation that happens there? What does it mean when you're leading a team of people and you're having experiences with others? And it might be in serving in your community. It might be something that you're caring for within your local congregation. Pausing to ask the question, how are lives being changed? That's a focus on the process, on the journey. Because I don't know any Christian leaders who have arrived at that place that they are fully as Jesus would have them be. We're still all on a journey.
But if they think they have, they've got a fixed mindset.
Right. Or if they think you have to have, I'm going back to what you were speaking of, you have to have a certain type of music for Jesus to be present. It has to be played in a certain way. You have to pray a prayer in a certain way.
So, Sarah, how this worked out in my ministry, it's not that I was thinking of it as fixed and growth mindset a few years ago, pastor of a church. And one of the values that church said was, we believe in the Bible and we like Bible study. So I asked them when they wanted to gather for Bible study, and they said, we don't have time. So I said, well, then we have to figure out a way to study the scripture. So I put together some short little Bible studies with a little explanation of the scripture and some questions, so that at every meeting, whether it was the church council, finance, trustees, staff parish, whatever it was, they all had a little Bible study, some questions to answer, and to pray for one another. My point in being what I'm saying and listening to you is that for the first few meetings with the trustees particularly, but then with the finance committee, they would say, why do we have to do this? That's not why we're here. But we said the mission of the church is to make disciples for the transformation of the world, but yet they didn't want to do that, to learn for the transformation. They just thought they were there to raise money and take care of a building. So they had a fixed mindset on what they were doing. The growth mindset would be, we are working on the facilities to facilitate making disciples for the transformation of the world. We're working on the finances for the purpose of making disciples for the transformation of the world. they would see their work in a larger piece than just a little piece they were working on.
Yeah, so go back to the definitions that we talked about at the beginning. Fixed mindset, you believe that people have basic abilities, intelligence, talents are just that, fixed. There's not an opportunity for change and transformation. In a growth mindset, people understand that their talents and abilities can be developed through effort, good teaching, and persistence. So if you want to connect what you're doing as a finance or trustee team to the mission of the church, as a Christ-centered leader, it might take effort. It might take good teaching. It might take persistence in doing that, because folks, they have one understanding of what their responsibility is and have not connected it to the larger mission. And so part of what you're trying to do, and part of what you talked about facilitating, was helping folks wherever they were serving connect what they are doing to the mission. And that mission, we all know it, is about transformation. That's the focus. So maybe the one thing that we need to say here is we've been focusing on how you are leading others. So as a leader, it's also important to stop and reflect on how are you embodying a growth mindset? How are you experiencing those things that help you to put forth effort, to experience the good teaching of others, and to persist in something new that might not come naturally to you, but it's something that you know that you need to learn. It's a new skill. It's a new talent. You've been asked to lead in a new way. Any thoughts on that one, Tim?
Well, you and I were talking before we started this podcast. Why don't you give them an example of one way that you've been learning, something that you've learned that's outside of ministry? Well, may not be outside of ministry, but it's not what we call mainstream ministry.
Part of how I continue to stay in a growth mindset is through creative outlets. Because as much as I love creativity, it's not always something that comes easy to me. And so a couple of years ago, I learned modern calligraphy. And when you learn modern calligraphy, there's a series of basic strokes that go into forming each of the letters of the alphabet. And you do it with a brush pen. You can do it with a traditional calligraphy dip pen, but I was doing it with a brush pen. And recently, the person who I learned from offered this basic class again, and I decided, because I'm kind of nuts, and to challenge myself, okay, I'm going to do this with a watercolor brush. Now, I cannot explain to you the level of difficulty that this brings, because if you've ever painted anything, even going back to elementary school, you know that the bristles on a paintbrush are very soft and often very floppy. And everything that I have written with up until this point has been a tip of a pen that is hard but flexible. And so why was I doing this? To challenge myself, to grow, to enhance my skills. It's a way that outside of ministry that I practice and participate in living what it means to be a growth mindset. And sometimes what I create is just downright ugly. Every once in a while, I'm surprised by the beauty of what comes out. So it's not about being the best, it's about learning. It's about the growth. It's about the challenge.
Yeah, I like that. Well, Sarah, even though that we've already said that traditionally we think that it's knowledge and information that gives us a growth mindset, I think it's really an intentionality. I don't think you step into it necessarily by accident. And so one of the things that I've been going through over the past several years, but several months particularly, because learner is in my top 5 of strengths, and because I have a degree in history, I like to discover how things have become the way they are, and have been doing lots of reading around some of the stuff that's behind our racial tension and the injustice that we've had. But every time I say that, I'm also thinking about how the world in which we live, and which has given me my values and that I keep questioning, has also marginalized women. So I need to tell you quickly, I have been reading a book called Black Aces. It's written by a man by the name of Jim Mudcat Grant. He was a pitcher for the Cleveland Indians, actually, when I started collecting baseball cards over 60 years ago. And he ended up pitching for the Minnesota Twins. Now, the whole point to all that is that because I'm a baseball fan, God can teach me through baseball things I need to understand. His book is about, when he says Black Aces, is about some of baseball's greatest pitchers who were black that won over 20 ball games in multiple seasons. We don't even have 20 game winners anymore. And there were some great players. And the reason that's interesting to me, number one, is because these were the pitchers as I was growing up that were really making a difference. But what he's done is told their story of the struggle and the things that they have gone through to be the people that they were. And the amazing thing is that Mudcat Grant was not just a pitcher. See, I sometimes think that baseball players, that's all they know to do, and then they take the summer or the winter off. But he actually sang in a band called Mudcat and the Kittens. and he traveled the country singing civil rights songs. And if they didn't have a song, they wrote one. And he's written a book about people who were marginalized and how they've added to the culture, even if it's through baseball. Now, one more, because I know I'm taking too much time. I've just started reading another book.
Hang on, before you continue on that, may I offer something of what you just, in response to what you just said about reading that book and about his experience, because I think both of you embodied a growth mindset, but you did it in different ways. The author, the baseball player, Mudcat Grant, was that his name?
Yes.
Mudcat Grant, from his skills and talent on a baseball field to singing on a stage to now telling a story to people long after those experiences happened, he believed if he did that, he had to believe that something could change, that by singing that song, something might change in the hearts of the people. By showing up in a time that playing baseball as a black pitcher was difficult could make a difference. And by writing a book and telling the stories, something might change in people's lives. He's seeing and embodying a growth mindset in that. You are embodying the growth mindset in saying where we are at in terms of our race relations and how we are responding to our differences as a country. What we're doing right now is not okay, and I need to understand what has happened so that I can look forward to what can be. Both of those are examples of growth mindsets. It's not simply the fact that you picked up a book that now you have a growth mindset. It was your approach to that process of learning and Mudcat Grant's approach to how he has lived his life that embodies that growth mindset. Sorry, didn't mean to go on that long. I just felt the need to articulate what I was hearing you say as it connected to a growth mindset. And
you brought about clarity. And so keeping that second one there, of why things are the way they are and how and what I might be able to do in the midst of that. It's not just information that I'm looking for. I'm looking to see how my life is transformed by that. I've just started reading another book called The Making of Biblical Womanhood by Beth Allison Barr from Baylor University. And what she's doing is going back with the context of the scripture and talking about how things were formed in those days when the scriptures were being recorded and the relationships of people, and how those things have been carried through and then shifted, and I'm going to say molded, to meet the needs of different cultures, and especially a culture in which we live in today, where we still marginalize women and objectify women, and how that has its roots in a misunderstanding of Scripture. I picked that up and began to read it for a couple of reasons. One of them is I ran into a review of the book, which was terrible. The review was speaking very badly about that material. And the reason they were speaking badly about it was because he was in a position of power and privilege, I would say, and he was defending the scripture from his point of view. And that has always bothered me. And so I'm trying to learn, why does that stir up something within me when I read something like that? When I began to read it, I became thankful that the people who are very influential in my life are mostly women. I mean, I'm talking about my wife, my daughter, my 3 granddaughters, you, Sarah, the people. I mean, if I told my story about Mary Hanley when I was in the 4th grade, the idea of how we push people off to the edges and want to cherry pick from them, if I may say it that way, instead of allowing what we learn and grow together to be the main part of our lives because we feel like we're going to lose something. I see that as being, there's a fixed mindset and there's a growth mindset. And one of the things you've heard me say is it does make a difference where you start. If you start with a fixed mindset with what you want to happen very beginning, and you're going to argue your case, there's not going to be any transformation. But if you can start with an open mind or a growth mindset, you may find out you'll go a lot farther down the road because you can't even see where you're going to end up yet. And that's really what we're talking about, learning leadership and courageous and effective leadership, is being who God would have you be at any moment, which will take you farther than you could ever have imagined or micromanaged.
That is a good word. So as we end this episode, leaving you to think about a growth mindset and a fixed mindset, maybe the first place to start is, what areas of your life and leadership do you have a fixed mindset around? And what areas of your life do you have a growth mindset around? Just think about where in your life are you able to show up with a growth mindset? Where in your life are you not able to show up with a growth mindset and have a fixed mindset? Second question is, what triggers you into having a fixed mindset? And finally, the third question is, what transformation is happening in your leadership? And yes, that goes directly back to having a growth mindset. So let me remind you once again, you can find show notes for this episode, including these 3 questions, at transformingmission.org/podcast, or by going directly to the episode at transformingmission.org/189. And remember, who you are is how you lead. Bye for now.